Bob has chosen for today, and it's from Ephesians 6, beginning with verse 10. Put on the whole armor of God, so that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For our struggle is not against enemies of blood and flesh, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, so that you may be able to withstand on that evil day, and having done everything, to stand firm. Stand therefore, and fasten the belt of truth around your waist, and put on the breastplate of righteousness. As shoes for your feet, put on whatever will make you ready to proclaim the gospel of peace. With all these, take the shield of faith, with which you will be able to quench all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. Pray in the Spirit at all times, in every prayer and supplication. To that end, keep alert and always persevere in supplication for all the saints. Pray also for me, so that when I speak, a message may be given to me to make known with boldness the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains. Pray that I may declare it boldly, as I must speak. So let's pray. Dear God, we're thankful again for Sabbath School, and we're thankful for all those around the circle who are joining with us this morning. We are thankful particularly for Bob, who's speaking to us from Switzerland, and we are looking forward to hearing much from him. We think of the twin themes of this passage. On the one hand, be strong, and on the other hand, resist evil. And those two themes seem appropriately fitting for our time today. Help us to learn from Bob, we pray in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
Over to you, Bob.
Well, let me share the screen first of all, and let's see how this works. Okay. Everyone can see this okay?
We don't see the screen sharing. At least I don't.
Yeah.
Is it? Oh, there it is. There it is. Okay.
Yeah. Why do missionaries serve? I might just mention that this is kind of a revised version of what I did at PUC by Zoom 2 months ago on February 16th. And so part of it, as you mentioned, I'm reaching you from Switzerland. I thought I would tantalize you for 2 minutes here on a couple of slides that I'm looking at out of the window. I see Forrest is smiling there. This is the little town of Aigle, where we get off the train, the main train, and then we go up on a little cog railroad. And we was walking to the train station yesterday and saw this sign in the window, an optician trying to talk about what's happening in the Ukraine. As we go up the train to where my son lives in a ski resort, we go past this castle, and we actually visited this just yesterday. Here you can see the train track going up. This is about 100 yards from where I'm sitting right now. And this is the view I'm looking at out of the window. So, so here's our porch looking out the window. This was sunset a couple of days ago. It's a beautiful little village. And then just down the way, about an hour away by train, the other day we were visiting our grandkids. These are 2 of our grandkids. So we're having a great time and being here. Just a couple of other sites from the famous Parliament building of the canton that we're in of Vaud. Okay, so our topic today, any comments or questions you can ask about where we are later, but I just thought I would hopefully put you in a nicer mood seeing that nice scenery. We're going to talk a little bit, it's going to be mainly, shall we say, some stories and memories from my perspective. Dave has sent you links to an SDA encyclopedia articles about my grandparents, both my grandmother Lillian and father Orly. But I thought should mention that our family has quite a history of missionaries in it. In the middle photo on the right, that's my wife's father, Arnold Storrs. He never was a missionary until he retired, actually. He was a pastor for all of his life, and then he came when we were working as missionaries in Rwanda and worked as a volunteer. His brother in the middle, Lester, some of you may have known him. He was a missionary to Vietnam many years. Bill Storrs on the left was a missionary all his career in India. Way off on the left, the three stooges here, from the oldest, that's my grandfather Orly, my father Eldon, and then me a few years ago when I even had hair. So, and then clear on the right, this is on my maternal grandparents, Edith Frye and my mother Vanessa. We'll talk about them a little bit next. We have a fairly long history of being involved in Latin America, and I'm just going to touch briefly on some of them, and you may have questions. There's much more that we could talk about here. My grandmother on my maternal side, Edith Frye, she was the first one to really go as a missionary to Latin America. In 1912 to 1917, she was a nurse in Puerto Rico, and she had been trained at the New England Sanitarium, and during World War I, the U-boats were threatening to sink the ships that could go back, and she managed to get back before getting sunk. So I thought, wow, that was wartime. And then she landed in Boston at the peak of the Spanish flu, okay? Another epidemic over 100 years ago, just about, and we're dealing with the same thing again. And she was treating in the New England Sand, an old schoolmate that she had gone to school with as an elementary school. And unfortunately, she died. And before she died, she asked, could you marry my husband and take care of him? And she married the gentleman you see at the bottom left there. That's Horace Standish from the famous Miles Standish family. And of course, from that union came my mother, and the rest is history, as they say. That's an interesting story on the Frye and Standish side of the family. There's other stories. Just briefly, I might mention at the top left, that's the Frye great-great-grandfather way on the left, and the two young girls that are obviously twins, dressed the same and looking like. One of them is Edith, my grandmother, and she's the one that went as a missionary. The father, the patriarch of this family, almost died at the battle in Vicksburg along the Mississippi River during the Civil War. So he fell overboard or was thrown overboard. They're not sure which it was when he was going north on a steamship when he was wounded. Came to, survived, made it back to New Hampshire, and had this large family. Anyway, the way life goes is really something. Just a couple of stories from the Ford side of the family. If you're looking at this bearded gentleman on the bottom left here, bottom right, this is Nineveh Ford, my great-great-grandfather. During the Civil War, or early part of the Civil War, in fact, long before it, he left because he was an abolitionist and lived in North Carolina. And he and his brother went eventually got on the caravan going west by Marcus Whitman on the Oregon Trail and ended up in Washington and was among the founders of Walla Walla College. His son, in the middle photo here, is we're looking at a nice gentleman with his son a little bit taller. That's my great-grandfather Willis Ford and my grandfather Orly Ford, who we're talking about today. And they became Adventists back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and thought that they would go as self-supporting colporteurs. This was when my grandfather was a teenager, to go to Cuba. And they went to Cuba. Unfortunately, great-grandfather Willis had a very hard time learning Spanish, so he got discouraged and came back. But that had kind of convinced my grandfather that he wanted to be a missionary, and he went on to be one that we'll talk about today.
Could I interrupt you back just for a second and go back to the previous slide?
Sure. Yeah.
Let's see, where is he? Is that the one that says he was no friend of Indians?
Yeah, that's the guy. We mentioned, remember when we were talking about Julius Lamb here, was it a few days ago? He was one of the first legislators in the Oregon Territory, and on his epitaph, written on his gravestone, unfortunately, it says, Nineveh Ford, a good Democrat and no Indian lover. Okay. And okay, now we laugh, but I mean it was very serious. He was involved in the posse of civilians along with military that chased down the Blackfeet Indians who had massacred Marcus Whitman and Narcissa Whitman. His son, here we have Willis Ford. He ended up joining a posse to go after the famous Chief Joseph. If any of you know anything about Indian history, this was the Nez Perce Indian. Chief Joseph and a lot of his tribes tried to go to Canada, went clear across from Idaho, Washington State, ended up in North Dakota, and they thought they had crossed the border into Canada and thought they were safe. But they were about 300 yards short, and the U.S. cavalry caught up with them, and there was a big massacre there. So there's some very interesting history, if you go back and look at it, some of it quite dark. Shall we go on then, Dave? Any other?
Thank you very much.
Yes. I might mention, let's talk about Orly and Lillian Ford. Those are the ones that many Adventists have heard about. Orly and Lillian went to to Walla Walla, went to Peru in 1917 as missionaries, and then they went to Ecuador later. They went initially to fill in for the very famous missionary Fernando and Anastal, who were going on furlough. I'll talk a little bit more about these pictures in a minute, but on the left, on the right is Orly and Lillian with their first child, Teddy, among the Indians on Lake Titicaca. There was a middle photo here when they were getting ready to go overseas, and then one on the left with their young baby, Teddy. Teddy, unfortunately, died in the mission field. But let me just say briefly something about the linkage with Fernando and Anastal, which I think is important. And we may talk more about this in the discussion. My folks took over, my grandparents, as they took over from Fernando and Anastal up in the highlands, Fernando and Ana went on furlough. When they went back, they went to the Amazon, and that's where a lot of people know about what Fernando and Ana Stahl did. And of course, they were very activist. And there was a wanted poster put up for them. And I thought I would just read what this wanted poster said, and we can maybe talk about it briefly. They were very involved in establishing schools that would teach the serfs, literally the peasants, how to read and write so they could better take care of themselves. And it says here on the poster, at these schools, they work a labor of dissolution. They spread doctrines of the most crimson communism. They attempt to destroy the patriotism and spirit of the nation by inculcating the most extreme and dangerous socialist concepts of social organization, class and racial equality, and unbounded liberty for the ignorant masses. Further, they openly criticize our property system. Of course, now, that was no back then. And there's a very beautiful article. Some of you may want to go and read this. It's available online. It was written by Charles Teal about Fernando and Ana Stahl and their work as social activists. And I'd like to read this little statement here because I think it kind of puts in perspective what some of these early missionaries thought their mission was. In the face of severe injustice, suffering, and oppression, the Stahls identified with the poorest of the poor and in the incarnated gospel in ways which profoundly impacted the spiritual, social, economic, and political life of the Peruvian highlands. The experience of our friends Ana and Fernando calls us to live with the tension of enacting the now of God's kingdom while recognizing that the not yet fullness of that kingdom eludes human history. So it's a very important message, and maybe we can come back and talk about it, unless you want to talk a little bit about it now, Dave. It's up to you.
Oh, let's keep going.
Okay. Here, there was another letter when my grandparents went to South America. They were sent in many respects from Walla Walla. There was a very active missions club, and they sent back a letter in 1920. And this letter describes a lot of their initial experiences. So we say how they went from the romantic view of being a missionary to the hard knocks and the sickness and the problems and losing their first child. And so it's a very heartwarming story. And many of these early missionaries sacrificed a lot. Why were they willing to do it? How did they do it? If we look at this on these three pictures, on the left, that's my grandfather up in the highlands with Arliss, one of their second child. That child died when they came on furlough. The middle photo is when they came on furlough, and one of them died. And then the earliest one, the picture on the right is Orly and Lillian with their first child, Teddy, that died. So, and we'll talk more about this a little bit later. But what other kinds of hard times did they face, do missionaries face? And I'm combining here a little bit from about my parents as well as my grandparents, because they worked together in later years. Just to maybe show the context, my grandparents lived in El Salvador for about 45 years after they worked in South America. And after my grandfather died, my grandmother stayed on. My parents went to work for 20 years in El Salvador and to take care of her, but at the same time to build the first private school, boarding school in the country. They went through many hard times. Just to show, this is a picture from earthquake in El Salvador, hurricane in Belize, There was volcanic eruptions that they dealt with in El Salvador. The book here, These Fords Still Run by Barbara Westphal, she recounts many close encounters with, shall we say, people throwing rocks at them from the mountains, many, many problems that they dealt with over the years. Probably the hardest event in their lives that they had to deal with was in 1943. They had lost 2 children already. They had 2 living, Sylvia and Eldon, my father and my aunt. And here you can see Sylvia with her younger brother. This is Donnie, and they were in Guatemala at this time. And then they had just moved to Costa Rica. He was 9 years old, and he loved animals. I won't read the whole story. You can go back and look at it. He was a great kid, just from the years we hear about him. But anyway, he got bit by a pet monkey that unfortunately had rabies, and he ended up dying of rabies. It was a very, very sad story. And this story was written by my grandmother and sent to the Review and Herald in 1943 about what it's like to be a bereaved mother as a missionary. It's a very touching story, very difficult one to talk about. I'm just going to briefly mention some of the different ways that the Fords served. What did it mean to serve as a missionary? And this brings in Loma Linda, by the way. So for those of you that are interested in how Loma Linda might have been involved in this missionary family, on the right, we see pictures of Orly Ford doing medical work in a clinic they established up along Lake Titicaca. Now, he's not a doctor. When they first went in 1917, they had 3 months training at the White Memorial Hospital and basic first aid and so on. But more than just first aid, it was kind of like, I guess, a physician's assistant type training. They went and they ended up doing so much medical work. It was so important. When they came back on furlough in 1923, they went to Loma Linda again, and they had 6 months more training and went back. And in his career, he ended up doing surgeries. He ended up doing amputations. He was, now, of course, that was a different history, but the College of Medical Evangelists was really the one that kind of established his form of mission for many years. And in fact, for those of you that live in Loma Linda, if you go down the memorial walk that goes between the Centennial Building and the academic, there's a stone there commemorating the Orly and Lillian Ford and what they learned in that. I'm not going to go all the stories, but a couple of other stories here that might be of interest. On the top left, that's my father in the white suit there. This is an ad in a school that they established in the Bay Islands of Honduras. Some of you may know Guanaja or Roatan. Some of you have probably gone diving there, but this is long before that era. And then I'll tie together the middle story. Here you picture on the top, you'll see some young guys collecting bananas and loading it on a cart. The man in the middle is a famous pastor from Honduras, and that was a very close friend of my dad. They helped to establish a school that was going to become the first Adventist school in Honduras that was teaching at a secondary and eventually college level. They managed to buy 1,500, close to 2,000 acres of beautiful farmland on the north coast of Honduras. And then the Adventists from the Bay Islands who had ships said, okay, we'll ship these bananas to the US and we will use the proceeds to pay for the school and to give free tuition to any student that wanted to come to the school. Now, this school was established in 1945 5 that lasted until 1951, but eventually went bankrupt because, unfortunately, the farm was right in the middle of land owned by the United Fruit Company. Now, if you ever heard, where does the term Banana Republic come from? This is a case study of it. They owned the railroads, they owned the shipping docks, they owned most of the ships. And here are these young spunky Adventists going to try to start a school, and they were going to bypass the United Fruit Company and then sell and take ships from the Bay Islands and go to the US and sell them and use it. But they had to run out of business, pushed out by the United Fruit Company, Standard Fruit Company. I'll mention about that later. That was really, my father tells me that was his saddest moment in history when that school closed up. The land, by the way, was taken over by the government, and has become one of the leading agricultural research institutions in the world dealing with tropical agriculture. So it was really kind of a sad story. Another maybe interesting story here, the bottom right, this young couple, very beautiful young couple, the gentleman there, his name is Lutz, Pastor Lutz. He was head of colporteuring for the Central American Union. He had come from Germany. He's 5'1" in height. I've met him once, very dynamic, but very short guy. He came as a unmarried pastor to work in Central America. Let me get back to this picture here. So here we are, and he wanted to get ordained. Back in those days, you were told if you're going to get ordained, you have to be married, okay? And so he said, well, how am I going to get a wife? I'm here in Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and so on. How do I get a wife? Okay, they said, well, we'll put you in touch with some beautiful young SDA girls back at our hospital in Germany. So they started writing, they had his pen pal club going, and he was writing letters back and forth. They got in touch with one he really loved. They proposed by mail. Okay, no internet, no Skype, nothing in those days. And so they said, okay, I'll join you. I'll come be your wife, and we'll meet you. So she arrives on a ship. It took about 3 months to come by ship. He met her at the dock, and she turns out to be 6'3" tall, and he's 5'1", okay? Now, they were a wonderful family. They had 7 kids. I ended up going to school with 2 of them. Some of you may know this family, but this wedding photo was taken this way because they had her sitting in a chair so he could stand. They wouldn't know that she's real tall. Okay. Anyway, Dave, I couldn't resist that one. I think
there's... man, it's beautiful, beautiful. It's all in the Lord's work.
In 1930, my grandparents came back to the U.S. from working in South America, and grandmother Lillian wrote a book. It's called In the High Andes, and I've scanned some pictures from it just so that you could see, writing about their first, 10, 15, 20 years in South America. And, this was published, and these are some of the pictures. There's very few of these books left. There's one that I put in the archives at PUC, and I'm just showing just a few of the slides of what it was like to be a missionary back in Peru and Bolivia and so on in those early days. Just to pick out one here, here's the Model T that my grandfather had. My father, Eldon, is standing on the hood, and in the background is Chimborazo, the highest volcano in the Andes. Okay, now when my grandfather got this car, He had it shipped to him by ocean. It took about 6 months. It came in a bunch of boxes, all the parts. And back in those days, you assembled the car yourself, okay? It was kind of like the Sears Roebuck of automobiles. So you ordered the car, it came to you, you put it together. He put it together, but there was about 3 or 4 parts left over. He couldn't figure out where it went. So he said, well, let's try it, see if it'll work. And they got there and it worked fine. He said, well, I guess we didn't need those parts, and it lasted for 5 years. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna continue here a little bit more. When my grandparents came back to the North America in 1929, at the peak of the Depression, they decided that they were gonna do some adventurous travel as well. And they got in a little small boats up in the Andes, hiked over the Andes, and here you can see some of the pictures and the bridges they were going across. Then they got in little canoes, went down the river to the Amazon, got on a steamboat, went out to the Brazilian coast, then went to New York. It took them 4 months to get there, landed in New York New Year's Day. And of course, they were used to the tropics. They were very cold. But on this trip, they collected hundreds of specimens of butterflies, of plants, all kinds of things. And a few years ago, while I worked in the United States government, I went to visit the Natural History Museum in New York and saw some of the specimens that they had brought back at that time. Here you can see some of the people that they were traveling with during that famous expedition. Just a little bit more about this family. Let's talk a little bit about Lillian Schaefer, my grandmother. She was the 13th of 14 children on a farm in Kansas, a big wheat farm. And if you'll notice the spelling of her name, Shafer, S-H-A-F-E-R. And this is a story that was very common back in the early era of World War I. When the Germans and the war came along, people that were German, she was German background. In fact, she spoke German until she was about 10 years of age, and then started to learn English. And they changed the spelling of their name because they didn't want it to look too German during World War I. Later, and here is a picture of grandmother Lillian and her one of her sisters, the one that's at the top here, and then Lillian is the bottom one. These two beautiful young sisters. Well, at the time, Lillian was a teenager. She liked to party. She liked to dance. Her mother was the only Adventist in this family of 15, and but there was one daughter who had also gotten baptized and had gone to become a school teacher in Washington State. So they said, Lillian, if you stay around here, you're just going to end up marrying some farmer and not do any real good. Why don't you go live with your sister in Washington and get an education? So she went to Washington, finished high school there, actually became converted, became baptized, went on to Walla Walla, and then she and my grandfather got together. They became missionaries, very, very powerful missionaries in Central America. These are just some other family photos. The one at the top left to me is very poignant, and I just thought I would read a little bit. I'll translate from the Spanish. This picture was taken very close to my grandfather's death. They were in their 80s at the time. And he says here, El Salvador is my second country. I want my remains to be buried with my wife in a cemetery in Ayutupeque, and let me see, Ayutuxtepeque. This is one of the churches that they helped to found there. My grandfather had a goal during the years he was in Central America of establishing either a new school or a new church every year that he worked there, and he did. And at the bottom left, this is Orly and Lillian at the General Conference of 1964, I believe it was, where they were honored guests for some of the work that they did. Let me just take a few more minutes here to talk about the legacy that they leave behind, because I think it's important. And here is one of the schools that they helped to found. This was about 15 years ago, 10 years ago, I guess now. I went to visit during a commemoration of both what Orly and Lillian did and my parents, Pastor Eldon and Vanessa. And you can see they had a kind of something up here about the pioneers. There's if you look at the bottom right, it says Libreria Adventista del Séptimo Día. That used to be my grandparents' home. It was a very large home, and a lot of missionaries used to stop and stay overnight there. If you've read the book, These Fords Still Run, that used to be called the Ford Hotel because so many people would stay there. In the top right is a little cafeteria for one of the schools they established that's named in the honor of my grandmother, Lillian. During the years that my grandmother lived with my parents, they established the first boarding school in El Salvador, ECAS. Some of you may know that. The top left is the largest church in El Salvador, established by my grandparents. It's across the street from their school. Bottom middle here is my mother with a whole bunch of former students of hers. This is taken in Loma Linda just before she died. She was being visited by former students that now live in the United States. Some other things about the legacy that I just found out about just a few months ago. Grandmother Lillian established the first Pathfinder Club in Central America. It grew to be a major movement, and here we see pictures of Pathfinders being involved with the COVID epidemic. This is in 1970, 71. And they were so active and so involved, it's become a major say community service organization. Here, there's a medallion that was put out in 2020 to commemorate 70 years of the Pathfinders in El Salvador, to commemorate some of the work they did. And this is some of what goes back to them. They are buried in El Salvador. I went down there for a commemoration of them a few years ago. Just another interesting family history connection. I'll just point out a couple of things here. On the right, this black and white photo, you see these little young kids. This is at Madison College in Tennessee. My grandfather Standish was one of the major, he was the builder of and head of industrial arts at Madison College in the early years under E.O. Sutherland. That's where my mother was born and her sister. And they lived in a small I guess you'd call it a condo today, apartment. The next door neighbor kid was this little boy. That little boy is Neil Wilson, who became General Conference president years later. So I won't go into some of my own personal history. I went as a missionary, my wife and I, to Rwanda. We helped to build the Adventist University of Central Africa. Of course, it's now grown to 7,000 students, and Loma Linda is now starting a medical school. So we're so proud to see a lot of that happen in our history and through our family. Okay, I'll stop there. And I don't know, Dave, if you want to just take a break at this time and then come back and have a discussion and some questions? What do you say?
Well, maybe we could take a couple of questions from here.
Okay.
And then we'll take a break and then get some from questions and comments from those who are online. Let me turn the sound down here so we don't get an echo.
Shall I stop the share or just leave this up on the screen? Okay, maybe I'll stop the share so I can see people's faces. Okay. Yeah. David, you're muted. Yeah.
Anybody here? Do you want to make a question or ask a question or make a comment?
It's just a remarkable family. Remarkable. So interesting, and I appreciate it. We need microphones, or can you hear me?
You know, we would like to have microphones, but for some reason they're not here.
Oh, we're not here today. Oh, okay.
Well, I can hear.
That's really a disadvantage. Can you hear us, Bob?
Yes, I can hear you fine. Just speak up loudly. Yeah.
David. But we don't hear you. Okay, Donna Carlson has a question or a comment.
Two things. One is just to thank you very much. What an interesting presentation. It reminded me a lot of Charlie Peel, my old friend, and I'm sure you had a lot in common with Charles. The other thing is a very funny thing. I noticed that your grandmother or great-grandmother's book, High in the Andes, I'm sure her authorship was listed as Mrs. Orly. So she in those days, I guess, was still a little behind her husband, but very fascinating. Thank you so much.
Okay, I might mention there that
I can't hear you, Bob. Hold on a second.
You can't hear me,
Bob?
No, I'm not muted.
I can't hear you, Bob.
Oh, 1 second. Maybe I've turned him off. 1 second.
We can hear him fine on
second.
Zoom. We can hear him fine.
I guess they're hearing me on Zoom, but
I hope
not.
we don't get an echo now.
Yeah.
I hear you fine, Bob.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just going to mention for those on Zoom, Charles Teal that was mentioned. This was when I was teaching in Loma Linda back in the 1980s, 1970s and 80s. I used to lead summer trips of medical students, dental students, and others to Central America. He came along with me on the second trip that we took. And some of you may remember Doug Havens, who used to be at La Sierra and also at Loma Linda. Well, Charles Teal came along with us when we went to Guatemala, and I introduced him both in Mexico and Guatemala to some of the leading Catholic proponents of what came to be known as liberationist theology. Some of you may remember that history, that particular branch of Catholicism that was pushing social reform and so on. Well, he really enjoyed that trip. I still have lovely pictures of introducing Charles Teal to some of these people. And then over the years after that, he went down every year to Latin America after I had gone to Africa. But I always was so thankful of what Charles Teal did to help to remember the work of some of these early missionaries, whether it be the Stalls or the Fords. There are many others that have worked in Latin America. And to show that early activism, social activism, are missionaries. And as we read earlier, I think we sometimes today, because of the polarized political environment we don't talk about as much about that social dimension of the gospel as maybe as we should. Maybe it's our fears of institutionalism, I don't know. But I miss those early missionaries and their work in the gospel, but also their work to deal with the real problems that people face. So I don't know, that's my little statement, political statement for the day.
Bob, if we asked them the question you've asked, why do you do this? Why do you serve? What would their answer be, you think?
I think it would be a multiple answer. One of them, if you look at a lot of these early missionaries, and I've talked to some and known some of them, when they were young, shall we say young and stupid, they wanted the adventure, they wanted the romantic view of traveling to a foreign country, and all of that's part of it. My grandfather was definitely that way. He loved adventure, he loved studying, he loved traveling. There was that. But they were very strong believers in the Advent message and the belief that the world was going to end very quickly and that we had a mission to go to the world. And so there was that strong commitment toward spreading the gospel, but they believed in a whole gospel, one that dealt with the real problems of the world today, as well as preparing for the future. So, it's hard to understand the complete, shall we say, character and background of these people, but you have to admire their ability to really be focused on this mission in very, very difficult times and to keep their faith. I don't know what else I could say, Dave. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. We're going to take a break, but a couple of announcements first. The first one is that the Sabbath seminar group just down the hall has invited us to join them for a potluck next week. And Vern Carner will be the guest of honor. So that will be a good chance to get reacquainted with Vern. We haven't seen him for quite some time. Then next Sabbath, maybe I can hold this up. We're going to talk about this book and with the author. The name of the book is Wait for God to Notice. It's by Sari, that's how she pronounces her name, Fordham. And this book is receiving very high reviews all over the country. Last time I heard her being interviewed, it was on Fresh Air, that program. What's the name of the woman on that?
Terry Gross.
Terry Gross. Terry Gross was inviting her. So she will be here. Now, we wondered if she should meet us on Zoom or whether she should come here. And I said, well, come here. Just think of it as a television studio. And then we'll have a good time here. We're in this transition. I'm not quite sure how it's going to turn out, but we'll keep at it till the end of June and see what happens then. Good to see you back, Ed Turner. Okay, here's the benediction, but we will continue after break with the people online and those who may want to stay. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
We're back on YouTube.
Okay.
Okay, well, I get to ask the first question. And I apologize because I was up at PUC 15 minutes ago for David Trim. I've been trying to get my brain around the enthusiasm that so many pioneer missionaries have held for going overseas and the hardships and the isolation and everything. And I think it would be, maybe you've thought about this, but I think it would be useful to unpack the theology, not only that the world must be warned, which is a process statement, but we are responsible for not spreading the gospel sufficiently, and thus we are guilty of delaying the second coming. How prevalent, now that was very common in the 1960s, at least at the General Conference. How prevalent was that in the original missionaries from North America.
Oh, absolutely. It was very, very powerful. I used to hear it from my grandparents and the other missionaries I met over the years. Very, very powerful. But you know, as I read from that article from Charles Teal earlier, they had this view about the future, you know, being prepared for, you know, the end of the world and the second coming and all that. That's their theological one. But they also had the view that you had to deal with the here and now. And they had very strong feelings about whether it was slavery, if you go all the way back to abolition, or whether it was about serfdom, as you might see among the Indians, or whether it was about inequality, or whether it was about capitalism in its worst forms, you know, like creating the banana republics that really destabilized much of that region. So, and of course, they loved to travel. They were explorers at heart. I think you'd have to be that kind of a person. If I can use a movie theme, you have to be a kind of an Indiana Jones type to do that kind of work. Does that make sense to you?
Well, that's a perspective we have now, and I think we've been greatly influenced by Charles Teal. But what I've also seen, particularly in China, is that they're converting people, but they're still going to live apart racially. The Caucasian missionaries will live apart in a compound. They educate their children in a separate school. So that Fernando Stahl was not the most common experience in the missionary movement.
No, you're right about that. But you know, from what I know, because I had a lot of friends that were missionary kids from China and from Southeast Asia, Philippines, it seems to me that it was more of an Asian phenomenon. My wife's uncle Bill, he spent all of his life the mission field in India, his working life, not all of his life. He helped establish Vincent Hill School. Any people know that history, where the missionary kids would go, and they would, as you said, they lived kind of separate cloistered lives. But at least among the missionaries that I knew in Central America, where I grew up, that wasn't the approach. We went to either the local public school. If there was no Adventist school, we did home study, some of it, but most of us, went to schools with the locals. I did my most of high school in Costa Rica, and I had 6 roommates. We were 7 in a bedroom. I can remember the first year I was in Costa Rica, I had a guy that had just literally come off the farm from an Indian reservation in Panama. I had a high-class son of a landowner from Guatemala. I had a grandson of a slave from Costa Rica. Totally mixed, totally intercultural. I learned Spanish, and I don't know. And my parents and my grandparents really believed that missionaries should mix and be totally involved in the local community. Now, I don't know if that was, just a Central American issue, but I think it was more the case in Latin America. I think you're also right, though, in parts of Africa, that was an issue. Because we served, in Africa for a while as missionaries, and there was a history there. And I can remember that often there would be discussions between the French missionaries versus the American missionaries about how their kids should or should not mix with the local peoples. And that was often a kind of a disputed issue. So I wouldn't say it's I think it depended on the division, it depended on the context, a lot of different things.
Yeah,
Bob, could I jump in on that?
I'm not sure why we got an echo there. Can you hear me? We have
Yes, I can.
not only an echo, but we have a time delay on the visual. Let me see first of all if I can get this down. I don't know, what can I do to get that down? In any case,
It's fine right now.
okay.
It's doing fine, Dave. Yeah.
All right. My impression growing up is that the missionaries in general and the missionary kids had a lot of fun. That they weren't people who were beset by anxiety. In fact, I don't remember much anxiety at all amongst the missionaries who came through Hawaii and so forth, or amongst those who were there. It was a good time. I asked a couple of my friends who are no longer Christians about this, and I said, did we have a lot of stress when we were growing up? And they said, oh no, we had a lot of fun. So I think that the idea that missionaries are always anxiety ridden is not my experience. First point. The second point is that I think it's quite common for Adventist ministers to get engaged in the more physical side of things. My father started a poi factory in Hawaii, and some of those people became millionaires afterwards. And also when he moved to the Big Island, he started a business of selling orchids. So they had to build up a business, and then they had another business of growing what they call lilikoi or passion fruit. So my father thought it was important to get people good jobs, good pay, and teach them how to be entrepreneurs. So that's the kind of thing I grew up with. Now, one other thing, I don't remember my father ever worrying about whether he was saved. That just never, whenever that question came up, he would say things like this: well, God is fair, and we can expect that God will do for us what we would want God to do. And that was it. We never had any stress about it. But the big anxiety was not about that. It was about whether they would find the strength to face the obstacles they did.
Mhm.
And that's why I found your passage of the reading today so very, very telling. It's Paul saying, if Paul wrote that, maybe he didn't. It's the writer of Ephesians saying, be strong, be bold, have no fear. And it was the sense that they were facing major obstacles and they may not have the strength to address them. That's what I think was a greater concern for them. So, yeah, there's a big difference. I'll go make this one last point. I think the biggest difference between Adventism now and the Adventism in which I grew up, where I grew up, is that since the book Questions on Doctrines was published, I think Adventists have become more and more preoccupied with their inner lives. How's the church doing on this? How's the church doing on that? And that was not really a part of the discussion when I was growing up. Questions on Doctrines split that all up. Questions on Doctrines split things. And then we've spent the last 50 years really worrying about ourselves, our internal lives. How well are we doing? How well are we doing that? And that was not an issue where I grew up and when I grew up. Now, Forrest wants to jump in here.
Yeah.
Can I say something about that, Dave? I absolutely agree with you. I think that focus has changed quite dramatically. And talking about trying to help people get new lives and new jobs. I mean, remember that German missionary, the colporteur I was talking to you about? Well, he worked for the church for 20 years, and then he retired and established a bee industry in southern Honduras with his 3 sons and 4 daughters. and it's now the biggest bee industry in Honduras. It ships all over the world. He hires people. My dad learned beekeeping from him, the old man Lutz, and helped to establish industries at our schools. Yeah, and I agree. I think they were more focused on helping people develop whole lives and develop businesses and to solve problems, to deal with social issues, as well as, of course, they had their very strong religious beliefs. But no, I think that after questions and doctrine, I think we've been spending too much time looking at our navel here the last 50 years. I'd agree. Mhm.
Yeah, let me say one thing here. My early years, from the age of 7 to 12, my parents were missionaries in South Africa. So I grew up, as a young boy in South Africa. Of course, that was the height of the apartheid situation. So I had a lot of fun, but I grew up in an environment during those 5 years where there were really 3 classes of people. And they didn't mix well together. You had the whites, you had what they called the natives, which were the Zulus, those tribes. And then you had the coloreds, which were a mixture of the white and blacks. And I can remember in the evangelistic meetings as a boy, they all sat separately. They didn't even sit together. They weren't allowed to mingle together. So
Yeah.
that was an interesting experience. But I had a lot of fun as a boy growing up there.
Yeah. The local situation really makes a big difference. And Ed, I worked for years in Rwanda with Dr. Wallace. You probably knew Elton Wallace. He had been one of the teachers there at our Adventist college in South Africa. And I remember him telling me what it was like at our Adventist college there in South Africa in those apartheid years. It was quite a different story.
Hildeberg College then is a lot different now.
That's for sure. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Forrest, sorry for you were going to ask something there, Forrest.
Yeah, well, I don't know. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, just fine. Yeah.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation today. Very helpful to look at our history. I think I've got a couple of things. First is, I think there's a strong argument to take American kids and bring them back and put them in a Western culture rather than be raised in a third world. And that the State Department and the Department of Defense deal with those issues as well.
Right.
So anyway, I just say I think there's an argument to bring kids back and if they're going to be Americans, let them be Americans or Europeans, whichever the case may be. Anyway, the other is, when I started in the ministry as a pastor, my job was to convert the world to Adventism, to have certain truths, Sabbath, State of the Dead, I don't know what else, 2,300 days. Did the early missionaries do a lot of that type of work as well? And is that true today in mission work? I'm just curious.
Well, I know better what they did in those early years, and there was definitely a big push toward, those key doctrines like the ones you mentioned, the Sabbath, the state of the dead, the second coming, things of that nature. But again, I'm not going to speak for the whole world, because I have found, having worked in different parts of the world, that it was different in different areas. In the Bay Islands, where I really grew up, that was the first place in the Inter-American Division that Adventism started. It started on the island of Roatan. And it started by missionaries that came down in a boat. The boat was built by, anyone remember ingathering? Okay.
No, blotted that out.
Okay. So anyway, ingathering, and then there was a special Sabbath offering, pennies offering, where they raised money all around the world to buy this little sailboat. The sailboat went down to the Cayman Islands and to the Roatan, and the first Adventists. Now, some of you may not know the history of Roatan, but Roatan back in the 1800s was a base for the pirates. Captain Morgan, he was a real guy, not just Disney World. and they were attacking the Spanish galleons that were bringing gold from Central America to Spain. Well, so these are mixed people speaking a Creole language, and the first Adventists were among these people, okay? And I can remember growing up, the kind of Adventism that I heard about. Some of it was really kind of funny. And everyone on Banaka, the small island where I grew up, they claimed they were Adventists, but many of them drank. They went off as sailors. They were pretty loose on stuff. And I remember my dad coming home at times saying, you know, I had to go down to the bar and break up a fight between two guys because they were both arguing about the state of the dead.
In a bar.
And this was at a bar, okay? And these two guys were arguing about theology, about which one was right, whether the Baptist preacher down the street or the Adventist preacher. And so I probably grew up with a very warped view of what Adventism was.
Yeah.
Is there anybody else online?
Yeah, Bob?
Yeah, I'm here.
There was a question, or in the chat, Carol asked about regarding the floating islands in Lake Titicaca. Are they were supposed to be all Adventists on those islands? Is that still true?
Well, they're not all that. There's several of them were in fact, that was one of the major areas that my grandparents went to work in, some of those areas on the Bolivian side of Lake Titicaca. And there are quite a few Adventists, but it's not all of them. But there are a few smaller ones that I believe are all Adventists. Could I comment something, Forrest, about an earlier thing you said, which it was in my life, and it's an interesting dilemma that many missionaries face, I think, even today, is when you have kids become teenagers and you're down living in a foreign culture. You know, I grew up speaking Creole. I went to the local private school. I went fishing. I had a little sailing boat. I was becoming a Bay Islander. I wasn't an American any longer. I went to 2 years high school in Costa Rica, but my parents said, well, you know, you're not, if we keep you here, you're going to end up marrying down here, and then you'll, you know, be here. So they made me go to the States for my senior year in high school. I went to Rio Lindo Academy, and the major reason was they said, you got to become a real American.
Yeah, right.
Well, Bob, I remember when you came.
Yeah, you were there. You remember, I was kind of a pretty, you know, I didn't know much of what's going on. I remember having guys down the hall arguing about the difference between a 57 and a 56 Chevy, and I barely knew the difference between a car and an ox cart. So I was kind of on the edge of things, but that year at Rio Lindo was very difficult, but it did shape my life in very important ways. And I know a lot of missionaries have gone through that kind of difficulty. Yeah.
Oh yeah, coming back. Now, we have to talk sometime about whether it's some kind of deep sin to want your children to be part of the culture from which you came. You know, is there something really, really bad about, if you're an American, wanting your children to be Americans? I'm not sure that that's the case. We would say, well, there's nothing wrong with Romanians. The Romanian people were here today, with them trying to keep their culture going here in California. So I think that it's a tough one. What to do with one's children?
Yeah, that's tough.
Out in the Orient, they sent their children to Far Eastern Academy. That was the place where all the kids went, and they had a great time there because they came from all over the Orient and had a time, and some of them were great times that we wouldn't recommend, generally speaking. But my memory of those days was that it was a pretty good bunch of people. Actually, I think they were happier than a lot of people around me now are. They weren't beset by all of these problems internally and externally that we now face.
Now, David, I might mention that German family that I talked about, the Lutz family. They had 7 kids, and I can remember talking with him. I was a teenager basically, and one of his daughters was kind of a girlfriend of mine in Costa Rica. They sent her to Costa Rica, and we were good friends. I talked to her once. Her name is Heidi, and I asked her, you know, what happened to all your older brothers and siblings? Did they get sent back to Germany? No, he said the Lutz thought that their kids should grow up and if they want to get married locally, fine. In fact, 3 or 4 of their kids married locally there in Honduras, and some of them still live there, and they're completely integrated into the Honduran society. They gave up their German citizenship. They are Honduranians. They're not Americans. Where part of the family, the 2 youngest kids, went to the U.S., became U.S. citizens. One of them married the former head of I won't say who they are, but former head of the Missions Institute at Andrews University. So I mean, these are really tough issues. I'm sure, you know, how you deal with family, how you deal with education, how much do you integrate with the local culture versus the foreign culture. They're difficult issues. Yeah.
Okay, we got another question from Michael here.
Yeah, this is turning out to be a panel of 5 people, but we're on the edge of some really gnarly 1-hour, 2-hour topics. I think the Adventist mission movement benefited from the colonial system of Europe, but the downside of that is all the abuses of imperialism,
Right.
Both in China and India and many other places. And how did the church deal with that? Or the abuses of indigenous dictators.
Right.
We seem to have had a policy of not rocking the boat and staying at peace with the existing government, no matter how corrupt it was. So Fernando Stahl's militancy was an unusual situation. Do you think these are all great topics, but we don't have time today? Go ahead, Bob.
Let me just mention a little bit about that. Over the last few months, I've been interviewing, or he interviewed me, a young gentleman from Brazil. He's an Adventist that set up a kind of an informal society of academics to try to lobby the church to speak up against some of the ills of the Bolsonaro regime, which is kind of an extreme right-wing regime. And it's exactly the issues you're talking about. And it's creating quite a division. That, you know, we have good friends in Brazil that we worked with in Africa. And it's interesting that I know one of the families are supportive of what Bolsonaro is doing. The other one is not. But all of them felt that, well, as citizens, you should speak up and do things, but don't get the church involved. That seems to be a kind of a playbook that you see around the world. And as a result, I think the church gets blamed sometimes for not speaking up against very obvious ills that are going on. And I don't know, maybe Ed has comments about how the church reacted to apartheid in South Africa, but I'm sure that was one of those issues that they were talking about.
Okay. Thank you.
I don't recall, Bob, that, of course, I was young at that time, the church really reacted. I think the church went along with, of course, there was heavily Dutch influence there in South Africa at the time. The church pretty well went along with what the government was. You know, if you try, I can imagine if you tried to hold evangelistic meetings with an open audience with no separation, there would have been some serious consequences.
Yeah. These are difficult issues, and trying to decide what to do as a policy for a whole church versus what you as a citizen believe that this is, and that won't end. I'm sure that's a problem even today.
Yeah. I have a quick question for you. A picture came across my desk here, Restored Child, and recently it showed 5 or 6 Maasai children, dirty, 5, 6, 7 years old, on the ground. Behind them was a young teenager, and what did he have in his hand? One of these. So my question to you is this: granted, when you grew up and you got back here to Rio Linda or wherever it was you were, and you felt somewhat isolated to the cultural, social issues of difference between a 56 and 57 Ford, is that isolation still an issue with social media and the worldwide access to the internet? I think that's all changed, hasn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I have gotten back in touch with Facebook and Instagram with some of the kids and people I grew up with in the Bay Islands. And so social has definitely changed the nature of interaction. Just to give you a little story, though, sometimes it can backfire on you. There's a gentleman I grew up with that's become quite a, if I can say so, more on the very conservative side of things in the Adventist Church. And I was speaking up on Facebook on some of the issues going on in Honduras. As you know, Honduras right now is kind of swinging to a semi-dictatorial government. And I was speaking up on Facebook to some of my friends in the Bay Islands. And this one guy got very upset at me, and then he blocked me from his Facebook post because he thought I was no longer an Adventist because I didn't go along with his view of things. So it is a different world, Ed, that's for sure.
Okay, Ed, or Bob.
Yeah.
Bob, I got Simona wants to ask a question. Simona?
Thank you. So I have a question. When we're talking about how children grow up and so on, I think we are hitting against the issue of identity. And I think when it comes to our church, there are lots of issues that I can see. And the first one that comes to my mind is, who are we first? So are we first human? Are we first Christian? Are we first Seventh-day Adventist? Are we first American? And what does that mean even? Right. And so I think that people who are probably consider themselves first human and Christian probably were not that much worried about their identity in national terms, whether they're American or German or anything else, or who they marry and how they marry them. Compared to others who put some other things first.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. Yeah, I'm absolutely right, Simona. And I think they're in Central America at the time. There were some missionaries, and I knew some of them that were more American than they were Christian, and this was part of the American imperial era, you know. And the church, unfortunately, I think often saw their mission not just as creating Christians, but creating little Americans. And of course, that backfired in many places throughout Latin America. In the Philippines and so on. And I remember as a missionary in Rwanda, running into some discussions of that kind itself. How should we relate to the local politics and government? Are we pushing certain things because we're Americans or because we're Christians and educated and want to treat all people equally? So these are tough questions, and they will keep coming back.
David, I don't have any questions. Hang on, Bob.
Okay, can you folks hear me?
Doing fine, yeah.
Okay, I wonder who is still with us online, and I'd like to know about this experience. We're having a time delay on the video, and I'm not quite sure why. This is the first time we've had that, but how's it going there? How's Arbalest doing in Zoomland?
Everything looks good.
Yeah,
Everything's
Oh,
great.
it's fine. There are
Yeah.
there are 13 of us on Zoom.
how many
13
right now?
right now.
Now, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh,
Everything's good, Dave.
Yeah, there
Yeah.
were more
Well,
before.
here's what's happened on campus. We had 15 the first week, then I think 12 last week. This week we had 3.
oh my.
So I think we're moving in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
But I think you also need to keep in mind that it's Easter Sabbath today.
Yeah. But Bob, I'm sorry, Mike Schofield just said that the PUC class decided to stay exclusively online, no longer to have a on-campus meeting.
Same thing with La Sierra.
And same thing with La Sierra. So is Sligo doing that as well? So it may be that having this kind of approach is not the wave of the future. Maybe it's a wave of the past. Maybe we're trying to recreate something that no longer is going to be because of the change in the social media and so forth. I'd like to hear anything anybody has to say. Mike,
Hybrid is very difficult, and there's only one class that's conquered it, but it takes a lot of work.
Mike, could you come and talk about this? You're into all these technical stuff.
Well, the only class that I've seen is down the hallway, but they spend an hour setting up the equipment.
Yeah.
And this is the benefit of Malin Coetzee, who's very clever with this technology. And other classes have contemplated, because I jump around from class to class, and it's very difficult. And over the year and a half to 2 years, this has realigned our loyalties. And each of these classes cares about their distant participants. La Sierra has one in Australia, one in Puget Sound, one in Las Vegas. The PUC class has people in England and Canada, and they don't want to lose. They've realigned the community, and that's going to create an interesting choice for them if we ever get off from full lockdown.
Well,
Yeah.
maybe
You're absolutely right. I follow sometimes the Sabbath seminars with Jim Walters and Coetzee, and I've been there in person and also spoken. And maybe just as an idea, maybe you need to recognize that there's 2 different kinds of communities now. You have this extended community, and you need to maybe create a mechanism for them to still interact and talk. And maybe it needs to be at a different time, I don't know, or continue at this time, but also then gradually have a new one on campus or recognize that maybe unless you spend the time to learn to use the technology appropriately, like Coetzee is doing, it'll be hard to maybe have them both united. I don't know.
If I could just say something, actually, one of the biggest mistakes people make when they try to do hybrid, they try to go too complicated. Just simplify things. You don't need 15 computers, you need just one. You don't need 3 cameras, you need just one. And so the simpler, the better.
Right.
Amen.
Yeah.
Dana there? Is Dana still there?
No, Dana left.
Oh, Dana left.
Yeah, she had to go for the communion.
You know what really frightens me? The prospect of trying to do both and losing both. Refusing to choose, and then the refusal to choose means that we lose on both ends. But
But David,
go ahead.
David, first of all, this is spring break. Lots of people are traveling with kids or grandkids. Secondly, it's Christmas. It's sorry, not Christmas. It's Easter, and it's Passover, and it's Ramadan, and it's so it's one of, I don't know, once in how many 100 years or so when all these things fall on the same weekend. So people are busy outside. So don't take today as a measure of how things are. Last week there were I don't know how many, almost 40 of us online. So I think you just need to consider things on a normal Sabbath instead of just this one.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree. Don't get too discouraged with it. The reason I'm in Switzerland is partly because the same time of the year as well. So you know, I think it'll just take some time. Keep it simple. I think it'll work out. Keep doing the work that you're doing.
Yeah, last week I was discouraged. This week I'm perplexed. I don't know if that's a or not, but pardon me, maybe I'm going the wrong direction. But this is a marvelous technology. Here we can talk to Bob in Switzerland. We can interact with him in Loma Linda, and there are people elsewhere. And what's interesting is a lot of people in Loma Linda are watching on Zoom.
Well,
Yeah.
they have
And-
legitimate reasons to be concerned about being exposed to us.
No, I think that's true, particularly my age group.
Yes.
I don't want to suggest that you folk are in that same cohort, but I am amongst the elderly and vulnerable.
And I'm older than you.
Now remember, Dave, that many more people. I quite often will listen to your broadcast afterward on Facebook or on you know, what's it called, YouTube. So don't forget that you know, not everyone that's on live that's not your only audience. So do good stuff, and then it spreads, and there'll be a lot of people that will be blessed by it.
Yeah, you know, last week, you're absolutely right. Last week, we had 70 people look on Facebook, and that's
Right.
not counting the YouTube people. So, yeah, I'm of good cheer this Sabbath, but it's starting to be funny. It's moved from being a tragedy. If this were a Shakespearean play, it's moved from being a tragedy to being a comedy.
Yeah, well, you know, talk with Malin Kutsi. Malin Kutsi has done a pretty good job with that other class of learning how to mix the technology, use it appropriately. You know, maybe instead of meeting in that big classroom that you're in, I know that's a big auditorium, maybe in a smaller classroom where you could manage things a little bit more effectively locally and then still maintain the Zoom audience. Maybe that would work better.
I think so. Maybe in one of the libraries here.
Right. Yeah. So no, keep working at it. Don't give up.
Yep. Okay. Thanks so much, Bob.
Okay. We'll see you guys. Thank
All
you.
right.
Well, wait, Bob, don't go yet.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Go ahead, McKinley.
All right, thank you very much. So Bob, thank you very much for the presentation and this really beautiful, rich history of your family services as missionaries. I really was blessed. Now, I was looking for this answer to the question of the presentation, why do missionaries serve? And you, I think, elaborated a little bit, but I want to bring it to the future. Some of the missionaries you said served because they believe in the whole gospel and the preparing people to live. I want to add another element to that. I think as a motivation, perhaps helping people to understand the concept of the abundant life and then helping them to grasp that or experience that. So with that said, I'm wondering how that same motivation can inform Adventist Christians' attitudes today towards people we encounter who are grappling with how to live amidst all of the pressures of life. Do we have an inspiration or a motivation to share what I think is really a special blessing that we Adventists have been exposed to? And then I'll give you an example.
Yeah. Okay. You wanting me to respond? Is that
Yes.
it? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. No, I think that's important. you know, I didn't mention that when I was in college, I was studying theology, but then I went to Loma and took a double master's degree in public health and anthropology. And part of the reason was, even though I felt that ministering to that broader needs of people, social, economic, you know, physical, all of those, the health issues, that was the important, that to me was what mission was. And I learned that from my grandfather. You know, he was a minister, but he said the first thing you need to deal with is to help people to live better lives. And if you can't help them to make a better life, then what's the purpose? So at least that's something I learned from both my parents and grandparents. And I think if we can keep that going, we're okay. But if we do, like what Dave was saying, you know, if we get caught up in all kinds of internal institutional debates about theology and creed and stuff like that, I think we've lost our way if we do that.
Thank you for sharing that. And again, the reason that I asked is I think like you, I encounter or live in an environment where there are not a lot of Adventists who I think have lifestyles that are informed by different philosophies. And many times in conversations, which involves getting to know these people, you find that they're really, really grappling with how to live.
Right.
And so if you know of something that can benefit another human being and you're not sharing it, aren't you complicit in the challenges that they continue to face in their lives?
Oh, no, absolutely. I agree. Now you and I have talked before, you know, that I know that you're you're a scientist, a technologist dealing with you know, air pollution and climate change. And I got involved as a geographer. I deal with issues of conservation and climate change and agriculture. And I don't see that as something extraneous to being a missionary, you know, whether, you know, and maybe I've got it all wrong, but to me, that's, you know, trying to create a better world and deal with the issues that we face today and being adaptable to those changes. You know, the Stalls had to deal with serfdom. Today we have to deal with climate change. Well, roll up your sleeves and get on with it, you know.